you know, the Lee Street riot was one of the major racial incidents in Louisiana during World War II. If you would, tell us what your family connection and your family stories are about that incident.
Okay, great. My dad was stationed here at Camp Claiborne back in the 40s when supposedly this Lee Street riot occurred.
Mm-hmm.
He happened to be on Lee Street the night of the riot. And the story that he tells, the whole thing began with a black soldier being arrested for having whistled at a white woman. And from there, things just began to escalate. The police arrested the black soldier and other black soldiers who were on Lee Street, because this was the place where the black soldiers would congregate, you know, on their off-duty time. So they began to gather around the policeman, and then it's my understanding from Dad that reinforcement came, and things just escalated from that particular point, to the point of where other police officers were called to the Lee Street area, and they began to walk down the street just indiscriminately shooting, you know, at the soldiers who were congregated on Lee Street. And Dad was very reluctant to really talk about this. Apparently it was a traumatic experience for him. He said the only thing that he believes that saved his life was the fact that someone touched him on his shoulder and pulled him inside of one of the restaurants there on Lee Street. Other than that, he probably would have been killed. Now, story has it that not very many people were injured that night. But from conversations with my dad, who again was there that night, he is saying that there were hundreds of people, hundreds of black soldiers that were killed that night, and that they were taken out of town on railroad cars, because the railroad was not that far up Lee Street. So those bodies were taken out of Alexandria on those railroad cars. Some also indicate that some of the soldiers who were killed that night are actually buried in the Lee Street area. There is a Union Baptist church on Lee Street, and in conversations with some other people in the community, it is alleged that there are actually people buried under that church. Now, I don't know if that's true. There's also a funeral home there, Good Shepherd Funeral Home, that's on Lee Street. And allegedly there are bodies that are buried under that funeral home. Now, whether or not all of that is true, I don't know. But I think the type of person that my dad was, you know, that something really traumatic happened that night is not a story that he would have made up. I don't think he would have, you know, just taken out of context the number of people that were killed that night. But again, he indicated that there were hundreds of soldiers who were in the area that night, and that hundreds of soldiers were killed. The other part of that story that he related to me was that when things began to escalate, that word got back to Camp Claiborne, and the black troops who were not on Lee Street that night began to come to Alexandria. And it is alleged that there were actually tanks that had come into Alexandria, and they were on the outskirts of Alexandria, and they were ready to actually come in and destroy Alexandria. But the commanding officer of the black unit at that particular time prevented that from happening. So that was as much as I was able to get out of Dad. And before his death, I wanted to talk more about him because I was very interested in following up on that story. But it was something that, you know, when we tried to sit down the second time and talk about it, he said, I don't want to remember that night. You know, I don't want to talk about it. You know, and I said for history's sake, it would be good. In fact, a gentleman from Alexandria wanted to come in and interview him regarding that night, and he refused to do so. You know, and I think he did because it was such a traumatic experience. But I'm glad that he was able to share that with me, you know, the parts of that night that he remembers.
Right, right. Yeah, that's a good story. And yeah, I've heard stories too that they shipped in big shipments of caskets secretly, and so there are all sorts of hints.
Right.
It's almost one of those things you can just about get out there and know you've got the truth, but it's just not quite there.
That's very true. And if you go back and talk to many of the older African Americans in the community now, they'll relate a similar story to you. You know,
Right.
There's one part of that story that kind of indicated that it was the military police, the white military police, that actually came in and did the shooting. But according to Dad, it was the city police, you know, and they were reinforced, and that's who did the shooting. And that they came down one end of Lee Street, and they were like shoulder to shoulder, and just indiscriminately shooting, you know, anyone that was in their way. And it was all because of the racial tension that existed at that particular time.
Sure. Really just almost an outgrowth of segregation.
Yes,
It was,
yes.
Yeah.
And I think this probably was one of the first activated black units of World War II that was trained here at Camp Claiborne.
Right.
What unit was he in?
I am not sure of the unit that he was in, but he was a medic.
Okay.
He was a medic, and after his training here in central Louisiana, he was sent to Guadalcanal, and that's where he spent his time during the war at Guadalcanal. But Dad was a medic.
Did he talk much about his experience at Camp Claiborne?
He did not. He did not talk about any segregation issues, things that occurred there. It was only when the soldiers came to town, apparently, that they faced these issues. I would imagine that at Camp Claiborne, they probably were a segregated unit, and they had their own barracks, etc., and they were just kind of hanging out among themselves. But the problems occurred whenever they came into the community. And at that particular time, Lee Street was the place where most of blacks in Alexandria did business. I can remember as a child, you know, going onto Lee Street, and it was some of the stores on Lee Street where we would get our school clothing, where we would get our shoes, you know, to wear to school or to wear to church. I can remember our family physician, Dr. Robinson, whose office was on Lee Street. And just off of Lee Street, a second family physician, Dr. Hines. His office was just off of Lee Street, across the street, in fact, from Dr. Robinson. I can also remember as a young child going to the movie theater on Lee Street. So that was kind of the place where, you know, we as blacks at that particular time would go and do our shopping and would go to the movies and would just hang out. It was really a great street. It was a thriving street, and it's sad to look at it now and see what it looks like now compared to what it looked like back in those days.
Yeah, there's really not much there. Jerry and I went over there a couple of months ago, and I was just astonished.
Yeah, there's not very much there at all now.
How abandoned.
Yeah, the funeral home is still there. The Union Historical Baptist Church is still there. The W.A. White Funeral Home, which is right across the street from Good Shepherd, that's still there. The building that housed Dr. Robinson's office is still there. It has a barber shop on one end, and then the far end of it has a Masonic lodge there. So that building is still there. But the theater is gone. The old gymnasium where the black Catholic school at that particular time, St. James, there was a gymnasium on that street where they held all of their basketball games. All of that is gone now.
You know, one of the kind of pieces of conventional wisdom about the war is that it is the key factor in helping to end segregation, because black troops demonstrated that the color of their skin didn't make any difference to how they performed on the battlefield. Did your dad have a sense of that? Did he get to enjoy feeling like he had been redeemed to a certain extent, or is that something that had to wait till the next generation?
No, he did. I think that his tour in the Army, he got to go to other parts of the country, you know, he got to go to other parts of the world. And he even indicated that they did face segregation issues even in countries that they went to, you know, during the war. But I would agree that I think the war kind of helped to bring the races together, that the black soldiers were able to prove themselves during the war, especially the Tuskegee Airmen, you know, the Buffalo Soldiers. You know, I think that those units were able to show that blacks had the intelligence, you know, had the skills that were necessary to help to bring this country to a different point in its history. And Dad, after his service in the Army, of course, he was from Mississippi originally and decided to live here in Louisiana. And he got into politics, and he served as a councilman in the town of Boyce for 32 years, you know, after that. So he became very involved in church work, and that experience on Lee Street didn't deter him from wanting to live in Louisiana, you know, so, you know,
That's good to know.
yeah.
When did he first get elected as a councilman in Boise?
Oh, goodness, I am not sure of the year that he got elected. I would have to go back and look at the records for that.
Probably in the mid-60s?
It was in the 60s, right? It would have been in the 60s.
Post-Voting Rights Act and all that.
Right, and in fact, he was the first black councilman elected to office in Rapides Parish. He and Reverend Freddie Banks were the first two councilmen that were elected to office in central Louisiana.
I remember Banks from Ellick, right?
He's from Ellick, right?
Yeah, okay.
Right.
Yeah.
I didn't know about your dad.
Yeah.
That makes it even better.
That's right.
That's right.
You know, my colleague Keith Finley tried to get some records about the Lee Street riots, and so much of it's been redacted that, you know, it's like the stuff that Mike Kurtz got about the Kennedy assassination. You know, it's a bunch of black marks with a word every now and then.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Bill Simpson, you know, did that as well. From the archives through the Freedom of Information Act, and what he got was practically worthless.
Yeah.
There's a very
Yeah.
similar story to the Lee Street riots that occurred in one of the bases in Mississippi. I don't remember the name of it, but when you read the account of what happened there and the hundreds of troops that were allegedly killed, it's like the two stories could have gotten crossed. Yeah, but this was a base in Mississippi, a fort in Mississippi. I don't remember the name of it.
Sadly, the idea that it might have happened twice doesn't seem outrageous.
Yeah.
That's right.
I mean, it seems outrageous, but it doesn't seem implausible. Let's put it like that.
I tried to find, in fact, when Dad passed away, I found in going through some of his things, his enlistment papers. There was a little pouch, you know, that they would wear on their belt that had their enlistment papers, and a unit was on there, and I tried to find that, and I could not find it. I'll have to check with my sisters and find out if maybe they put it up somewhere. But it was back from 1941.
So he did the whole war.
He did.
Jerry, you got more?
Guess that's it, huh?
I think that's great. That's going to be good.